Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So we are going to finish our discussion on nutrient cycles by talking about the phosphorus cycle today. So phosphorus is found in a lot of molecules in living things, particularly things like ATP, right? So we've got those three phosphate groups there. That's your main energy molecule, as well as things like DNA and RNA, having those phosphate groups as part of our genetic information, as well as being able to move that genetic information into instructions that can eventually be created into proteins. We also see phosphorus in a lot of other major structures, bones, teeth, for example. And the interesting thing of all of the cycles that we've talked about, this particular cycle is probably one of the hardest to measure and understand simply because a lot of the processes that are going on take place through geologic processes as opposed to something like photosynthesis or cellular respiration in our carbon cycle that is pretty visibly living. And it is also incredibly slow for how quickly we see things like photosynthesis create sugars and oxygen to be used up by organisms to recycle it back. That's not going to be the case here. This is going to be very much a slow process because we are working on much more of a geologic time scale, which is much longer than your typical life cycle of a living thing. But all that being said, they definitely cycle phosphorus through living organisms, through soil, through water, and we need it to be there. Otherwise, we don't have any energy and we don't have any instructions to guide our bodies on how to function and how to be structured. So phosphorus enters both the soil and the water in a couple of different ways. So one of the biggest ones and one of the longest um, processes to occur is when rocks erode or weather, right? So we've got all this phosphorus built up in the rocks of things like mountains and major land masses. When that rains, that exposed rock um, gets eroded away by that rain, wearing it down. Water is very good at dissolving things, including components in rocks, just over very long periods of time. Wind can also do the same thing. We'll also see that a lot of phosphorus ends up entering soils via animal waste, so urine and feces. It can also enter from decomposing organisms, and when that land gets washed by weather patterns, rain patterns, snow melt, eventually that phosphorus gets washed into major aquatic ecosystems and ultimately out into the oceans. So plants are able to absorb that phosphorus through their roots. So they'll take it out of the soil and they will then be able to incorporate it into molecules like ATP and like their genetic material. And as those producers get consumed up the food chain and other consumers get consumed up that food chain, that phosphorus then gets moved through that food chain via those feeding relationships. Once those living things then die, the decomposers, bacteria, fungi, and that sort of thing in the soil will then break down those organisms, partly breaking down those phosphorus containing compounds as well, and return them back to the soil. That can then either get retaken back up by plants nearby or can end up into soil samples and water samples and get washed off into our aquatic ecosystems and then ultimately into our marine ecosystems, which is where most of the geologic cycling is going to occur. So that phosphorus flows with that groundwater to a lake or to an ocean and ultimately settles out to the bottom. So it'll end up in that phosphate in solution. And so long as that aquatic ecosystem is sort of calm enough, that sediment can then settle down to the bottom when we just keep building layers, right? And eventually enough layers build on top of each other, creating pressure that will then convert that sediment back into new rock. And because of geologic processes like uplift, mountain building processes, for example, eventually that rock will sort of get pushed back up to the surface to allow for rain and weathering processes to once again sort of break it down off of those major rock formations, return it back to the soil to then be reuptake by living plants that then work it up the food chain. Decomposition happens again, runoff happens eventually from excess phosphate, um, and we form those rocks. But this process right here of the rock formation, the geologic uplift, that's what makes this cycle so slow, because those geologic processes are not ones that happen within our lifetime by any means. So humans can have impacts here on this cycle as well. One of the big ones is, once again, those fertilizers. So plants need that phosphorus in order to grow, just like they need the nitrogen. And so we see the same um, impacts of having excess fertilizer that we talked about in the nitrogen cycle, causing algal blooms as well by having excess phosphorus on those fertilizers, being leached into our water tables and running off to aquatic ecosystems. And then again, those algal blooms will have the same effect. Um, Algae will overgrow, suck up excess oxygen, prevent sunlight from getting to plants below them, creating those anoxic environments where all of the organisms below the surface that still require that oxygen are now depleted of it. They die, they decompose, and you just really get this domino effect that is incredibly hard to reverse. Sewage also can release phosphorus into our ecosystems if that sewage isn't properly managed. So we're, sewage is general waste, both human and otherwise, and so we can get some of that phosphorus back there. A lot of soap products also contain phosphorus and can get washed into aquatic ecosystems. Again, having too much phosphorus wherever it's coming from, whether it's fertilizers, soaps, sewage, whatever, compounds the problem of those algal blooms. Um, Mining processes also increase phosphorus in the environment. So we talk about the weathering and erosion of how that phosphorus can get released to soils and be available to plants, and we want that at a sustainable level. But that mining basically takes that weathering and erosion process and puts the fast forward button on it, makes it happen much more quickly than natural processes would. And so you can get an overabundance of the phosphorus by mining the rock into the neighboring ecosystems, and there's just not enough plant life to absorb it all. And so you end up with the same problem. It gets run off into aquatic ecosystems, and we create those algal blooms all over again.